Here is Monteverde Strawberry Shortcake. And this is a very orange leaning red that looks just the same in the writing sample as it does in the swatch. This is a fairly, though not perfectly consistent tone as papers change. It only shows as different looking side by side, and it does shade in many of the writing samples. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it performs generally well, and I can't help say how nice it would be to see a paper graded with this ink named Strawberry Shortcake. How fun. Yes, this is a good ink for student use. This is a very fun color with a fun name. I would love a bottle of this ink.
The pen for today is a Kaweco Sport. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
A lighter mid-tone of red with that slight orange lean really being evident on this bright white paper. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, barely has anything for shading at all. You have to look for it. If you look at "and" right here, the A is ever so slightly lighter. Or in 3 on the third line, the T is ever so slightly lighter. The H is a bit darker than the rest of the word, but for the most part, it comes across as a very uniform tone. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting.
Monteverde makes more than just one ink, so let's take a look at a few other inks from Monteverde.
Here is Monteverde Blue Black. Here is Monteverde Smoke Noir. Here is Monteverde Horizon Blue. Here is Monteverde Toucan.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine that does not feather, does not spread, does not shade, just is easy to read on the paper. Doing a very nice job of that part of the function of ink. This is not a color that says, I need this on this paper, though. Looking at the back of the page, we see it does get fairly deep, quite a bit into the paper. Never bleeding through to touch the page underneath. The ghosting's not too much of a problem. However, I still would not write on the back of this paper just with the way this is looking to me in my eye.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here the tone is noticeably lighter and noticeably more orange than it was on the Clairfontaine. This is being affected by the tone of the paper underneath, meaning the ink we have is a bit more translucent. Now, there's a couple tiny spots of feathering that do occur. They're not huge. They're not a problem. They're not distracting, but they are present. It's not spreading and it's not shading. It's also not a red anymore. I'm not counting that part against it because of the tone of the paper. This, as an orange on this paper, is not a bad color. If this was the orange we were getting, this would not be too bad. Looking at the back of the page, you see a lot of spots. It gets very deep into the paper. The ghosting's not out of control, but it is this spotting. None of it bled through to touch the page underneath, but these two combined means I would not be taking notes back here.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, this smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread. It does shade, I think, a little more noticeably than it does on the Clairfontaine. You can see it a little bit with containing on the third line, much more with into on the third line, even with second on the second line. There's many more words containing elements of shading than there was on the Clairfontaine, like elements on the first line. It also stands out against the quad rule with no problems whatsoever, making this a good ink if this is the type of paper you go for. Looking at the back of the page, we have no problem for ghosting. We do have a few problems when it comes to the ink getting deeper into the page. None of these bled through to touch the page underneath. And because of the tone of this ink, I doubt it would stop you from writing back here. These are just points to be aware of.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more red inks.
Here is Three Oysters, Dan Xiong. Here is Noodler's Park Red. Here is Organic Studios Rogalian. Here is Robert Oster Royal Red.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here the tone is lighter and flatter than it is on the Clairfontaine, considerably flatter, considerably lighter. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It does have some shading, more as a word-to-word thing. Take a look at restarted and follows on the first line. It does continue to stand out against the quad rule without any kind of a problem, and it does come across as a non-standard red, which could be very nice in student notes. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Lamy Benetite. Here is Diamine Gray. Here is Noodler's Navy. Here is Thornton's Black.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here the tone is a whole lot lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now, it doesn't appear to be feathering. It does appear to have the normal amount of spread that we would expect for on 20-pound copy paper. It does have light moments. I say moments because they're very light of shading. The is slightly darker than equivalents next to it, but only slightly. I do think if the performance can hold up, this could be a decent ink to use on copy paper. Looking at the back of the page, the ghosting's not any kind of a problem. There are spots that got deeper into the paper. Nothing bled through touching the page underneath, but I don't think I would be taking notes back here with the deeper penetration of the ink. It is copy paper after all.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The medium flow, medium nib of the Kaweco Sport gives a fun orange leaning red that does shade. Now it's orange leaning red, so it is a red. Off camera, I tried this in a wet medium and it darkened and was frankly less fun as a color. So I would avoid wet pens, but medium flow pens of any standard nib size would serve up a fun tone with shading that maybe will make it easier to accept corrections.